Welcome back. All right. So I want to talk about the playoffs. There was a comment I made in a recent video that there was some discussion about. So I want to do a video on that, which is that power rankings get tossed out the window when it comes to playoffs. Now, I continue to update the board. What I do is that the teams that lose in the first round, I seed them by how well I think they did in the first round. Teams that lose in the second round occupy spots 8 through 5. 4 and 3 then are your final or your semi-finalists or conference finalists, runners up. We're losing teams. And then the Stanley Cup finalist that doesn't win sits at number 2 on the board. And then number 1's your Stanley Cup champion. And that's how it is at the end of the year. And I leave it that way until we get into free agency, trades, things of that nature. And even then, I don't change the power rankings much. But the question becomes, well, if the power rankings don't matter come playoff time, why do they matter during the regular season? Because it's a completely different beast. So you're a number 8 seed. You get into the playoffs, regardless of what it is, you're number 8 seed, or in current case, you'd be the number 2 wild card, right? So as the number 2 wild card, you're not going to be favored going into that first series. It's just the way that works. That being said, if you're able to neutralize their top line, if you're able to get better goaltending than the other team does, maybe a lucky bounce. Maybe you win a game in overtime. Whatever happens, you start to turn that tide in your favor. It can be tough for the favorite to turn it around. So I wanted to take a look at this and use 5 years of playoffs for this, because I don't want it to just be 1 year, because 1 year, things can happen. But over the last 3 playoffs, 14 out of 24 rounds have been won by lower seeds. Now, here's a qualifier. 2020, I used the qualifying round rather than round 1 because I felt like the qualifying round completely changed everything. And it did. When we got into round 1, the official round 1 for the playoffs, the higher seed won 6 out of 8 times. And I think what helped was that the higher seeds were all playing in a tournament against each other that just decided the seedings. And the other teams were going through, in some cases, pretty brutal series in order to qualify for that first round. So if you are of the belief that there should be a play-in round, that works to your benefit. But again, we've discussed that lately. Move on past that. I want to talk about how often we see upsets. Now, a lower seed doesn't mean an upset, because originally I had up here underdogs, and I thought, no, not all these teams were underdogs. They were just teams that started out as the road team. Or in 2020, of course, that was different because it was, bubble. You had Toronto and you had Edmonton. So this past year, 2021, 5 out of 8 teams that started the playoffs on the road end up winning their series. So Carolina was the number 1 seed. They beat Nashville, a number 4 seed. So that series goes the way everybody expected. Tampa Bay, the number 3 seed, beat Florida, the number 2 seed, in 6 games. Now, where you see an asterisk, that means that it's a team that had the upset, or was the lower seed, that won game 1. Winning game 1 is huge. And this is the problem for people who want to make it, I don't want to say easier for the top seeds, but I know at this time every year we hear, well, the top seed should have more of an advantage. But if they don't win game 1, that advantage is kind of gone. Now, home ice advantage technically belongs to the lower seed because they have games 3, 4, and 6 at home. And so all they have to do is not lose at home. Don Cherry always said, you're not in trouble until you lose your first home game, right? And that's true. So Tampa Bay wins that first game in Florida, and then they win the series in 6. Now, game 6, of course, being in Florida, but that they still had the advantage at that point. The New York Islanders, they were number 4 seed. They beat number 1 seeded Pittsburgh. They won that series in 6. They also won game 1. So you win in Pittsburgh. They end up winning the series in Pittsburgh. Or no, they won the series at home in game 6. Sorry, Tampa wins at home in game 6. Got thrown off. And then Pittsburgh, of course, they're the road team for game 6 in New York. So you can win that game at home if you're Tampa Bay or the Islanders. You don't have to worry about game 7. That's the funny part is, almost every single case here, you don't have to worry about game 7. There's only one instance here where it's a game 7, and there's one instance from 2020 where it's a game 5. Then Boston beats Washington. Boston was number 3 seed. Washington was the number 2 seed. That was a 5-game series. Oddly, Washington wins the first game. Boston wins the next 4. So game 5 was in Washington. Boston ends up winning it on the road. Montreal, famously, a number 4 seed, beats Toronto last year. They did win game 1. oddly, they lose the next 3 before they won the next 3. So that was a bizarre series that definitely felt like Toronto just didn't have that ability to overcome the odds and win that round. And by the odds, I mean kind of themselves. It felt like they kind of beat themselves in that series. Winnipeg, number 3 seed, beat Edmonton. They won the first game, and then they won the next 3. They swept it. So you win both games on the road. You just go home and win your games at home. Series is over. Colorado was the number 1 seed. They beat number 4 seeded St. Louis. Vegas, a number 2 seed. They beat number 3 seeded Minnesota. So, 5 out of 8 ended up being the lower seeds winning the series. So during the regular season, sure, the teams that were the higher seeds had a really good regular season. You get into that series, and you can tear apart any of these series for how they ended up turning against the higher seed, whether it was goaltending, whether it was special teams, or just a lucky goal. It can just be that easy. 2020, the qualifying round. And of course, the other thing that should be an asterisk with this too is that we went from the middle of March until August before these playoffs got started. Now, the rosters were frozen, so there wasn't anything different, but it was like it was a new season. So Montreal, the number 12 seed, they beat Pittsburgh. They won game 1 in that series. They ended up winning that series 3-1. And remember, the qualifying round was 3 out of 5 instead of 2 out of 3 because of Montreal. In large part, the players didn't like the idea of a 2 out of 3 series because they felt like Carey Price could steal a 2 out of 3 series. So Carey Price stole a 3 out of 5 series instead. Carolina, the number 6 seed, they beat. They didn't beat themselves. Teams have beaten themselves before, but not in actuality. They beat the New York Rangers, who were the number 11 seed. Interestingly enough, the Canes weren't all that happy about that matchup because the Rangers had handled them during the regular season. But Carolina swept them. The New York Islanders, number 7, they beat Florida, the number 10 seed. That was kind of disheartening for me because I really felt like Florida was ready to go on a run. It didn't happen. Columbus, the number 9 seed, beat Toronto, the number 8 seed. They did win that first game. They end up winning it in 5 in Toronto. So, again, Toronto upset 2 years in a row. They'll be trying to overcome that this year, where they're the number 2 seed. So we'll see if that happens. The number 12 seeded Chicago beat number 5 seeded Edmonton. That was 3-1, and they won game 1 in that one too. Arizona, the number 11 seed, beat Nashville, the number 6 seed. That was the 3-1 series. They won game 1 in that one too. So in all 4 of the upsets, game 1 goes to the underdog. Vancouver, number 7, beats number 10 Minnesota. Oddly enough, in that series, Minnesota wins the first game before Vancouver wins 3 in a row. Calgary, the number 8 seed, they beat Winnipeg, the number 9 seed in that series. So you end up with 4 out of 8 being underdogs, where there really shouldn't have been underdogs winning. Like Chicago and Montreal winning really threw people off because they did not have good regular seasons. And this is one of the reasons why I would actually not be in favor of the expansion of the playoffs, because you're going to end up in a situation where a team that may not have even been 500 during the regular season ends up going on a run. We've seen it before. We used to see it a lot in hockey. We haven't seen it lately because those teams get, weeded out. They don't make it into the playoffs. But absolutely, there's no pressure. They may be able to go on a bit of a run. You get a hot goaltender. You get the right scoring. Maybe you've got a really lethal power play for a while. It's just about getting hot at the right time. 2019, famously filled with upsets. Columbus, a wild card, beats Tampa Bay, the number 1 seed, in 4. I'm wearing Columbus because famously I said Columbus is dead, and they weren't. It was over 3 years ago. So that takes place. Boston, the number 2 seed, they beat Toronto, the number 3 seed. I don't know if you guys have heard about that or not. The media almost never mentions the Boston-Toronto matchups. Carolina, wildcard. I'm obviously kidding on that one. Carolina, wildcard, beats Washington, the number 1 seed. This is the only one on the board where the upset is in 7, other than Montreal over Toronto. And it's the only one where the underdog did not win game 1. And it was double overtime in game 7 before Carolina takes out Washington. That was an absolutely fantastic series. And so if we see them against each other at some point, and odds are we probably don't this year, but honestly, I'd like to see it again because these teams don't like each other and they have great series. The New York Islanders were number 2 seed. They beat Pittsburgh, the number 3 seed. Interestingly, with that one, I remember picking Pittsburgh in that series, and a lot of people did. It's the Sidney Crosby factor. Plus, they had won the Cup in 2017, so the fact they were a lower seed didn't stop people from picking them. Dallas was a wild card. They beat Nashville, the number 1 seed, and they won game 1 in that series before they won it in 6. So they won at home in game 6. St. Louis did much the same against Winnipeg. What was interesting with that series was St. Louis, the lower seed, they won both games in Winnipeg. Then they go home and they lost both games in St. Louis. So Winnipeg just had to win at home. They didn't. And in game 6, St. Louis wins the first home game that anybody had in the entire series, and they won it. And oddly enough, they win the Stanley Cup. So your Stanley Cup winner is a team that gets an upset here. Tampa Bay gets I'm not going to say upset, but they were the lower seed, and they win the Stanley Cup. They were the lower seed that won round 1 in 2021. Of course, in 2020, Tampa Bay is the number 2 seed in the East. Due to that tournament, they had to decide who ends up finishing where 1 through 4. And as I said, 6 out of 8 times in round 1, the higher seed won. So 2018, or no, we're not to 2018 yet. Colorado, the wild card, beat Calgary. The interesting part of that being Calgary had won game 1, and then Colorado won the next 4. San Jose, the number 2 seed, beat Vegas, the number 3 seed. And it was very similar to the Islanders in Pittsburgh. People felt Vegas was going to win that series. I remember thinking Vegas would win that series as well, and it looked like they were going to, and then they didn't. So it is interesting how these series end up taking place and how they unfold. And again, because it's one team against one other, it is really hard for me to look at that board right there and say, well, clearly this is going to work. And that's why I talk about which matchups I think are better for teams. 2018 was pretty straightforward. There's only one upset out of the 8 series. So Tampa Bay, number 1 seed, beat the New Jersey Devils, who were a wild card. Boston were number 2. They beat Toronto, who were number 3. Boston does well against Toronto. Washington, the number 1 seed, they beat Columbus, who were the wild card. Pittsburgh, the number 2 seed, beat Philadelphia, who were the number 3 seed, which set up a Washington-Pittsburgh series. It was fantastic. Nashville, number 1 seed, beats Colorado, who were a wild card. Winnipeg, number 2 seed, beats Minnesota, who were number 3. Vegas, the number 1 seed, beat LA, who were a wild card. And San Jose was the upset. They won in all 4 games against Anaheim, meaning they did win in game 1 on the road, and then they just steamrolled from there before Vegas then ended their run very quickly in Series 2. So, or Round 2, the series between those teams. So it is interesting to see that there's only one upset, and it's a mild upset. San Jose upsetting Anaheim was not considered a major surprise at the time. So 2017, not a lot of upsets that year either, although it's almost half. New York Rangers, wild card, they beat Montreal, who were the number 1 seed. They won game 1. They end up winning in 6. So that's at home. Ottawa, number 2 seed, they beat Boston, the number 3. And very often, looking back to 2017, Sens fans will talk about the underdog run they had. They weren't really underdogs, though, because they had home ice against Boston. They had home ice against the Rangers as well. And then, of course, Pittsburgh, they end up losing. It was a close series, but they weren't seen as, like, hugely below Pittsburgh. Just Pittsburgh was defending Stanley Cup champions. Washington, number 1 seed, they beat Toronto as a wild card. That was the first year for Matthews. Pittsburgh, number 2 seed, beat Columbus, the number 3 seed. Columbus didn't win anything until 2019 when they knocked out Tampa in 4 straight. So that's what made it more remarkable. Nashville, wild card, they swept the Chicago Blackhawks, who were the number 1 seed. And to do 4 straight, of course, they win game 1 in Chicago and didn't really give Chicago much. And that was an indicator that Chicago's time as one of the best teams in the league was over. They've never gotten back to that again. Despite 2020, they did knock out Edmonton. They then got knocked out in round 1 relatively quickly. St. Louis, the number 3 seed, they beat Minnesota, the number 2 seed. They won game 1 in that. They ended up winning that series in 5. Anaheim was the favorite. They beat Calgary, the wild card. They were the number 1 team in the Pacific. Edmonton, number 2, beat San Jose, who were number 3 that year. So only 3 out of 5, or 3 out of 8. So it is very unpredictable. We may be into one of those years that ends up like 2020 or 2018, the even-numbered years, where 6 out of 8, once we got into round 1, ended up being the ones that win. If the home team ends up winning. 2020, of course, home team is a very subjective term because it was the bubble playoffs, and maybe that made it easier for upsets, so maybe you can kind of toss that out. But then last year, we had 5 upsets. 5 lower seeds winning. I want to say upsets, but it's not always an upset when a lower seed wins. And this, again, comes back to the whole idea of power rankings and trying to say, okay, so out of 32 teams, where do these all stack up? And then when you get into the playoffs, it's just 2 teams against one another. So like we have right now, we know that St. Louis is going to play Edmonton, or St. Louis is going to play Minnesota. Edmonton's going to play LA, right? St. Louis, I think, are going to be seen as favorites. And I don't think it matters whether Minnesota ends up with home ice or St. Louis ends up with home ice. St. Louis, with the depth of scoring, with the experience they have with the Stanley Cup from 2019, and the fact that a lot of the players are still there, is going to make them favorites. Minnesota, there's a lot to be excited about with Minnesota. Absolutely, they can pull that series off, but St. Louis will probably end up being the one that's favored. So in the case that, let's say St. Louis ends up being the number 2 seed and they win, that ends up being green on the board. But if Minnesota's the top seed and St. Louis wins, then it's red on the board, right? Because that means the lower seed won. And that's where the difference is between, and this is also a talking point, is, well, what about the standings? The standings tell you who's got the most points. It doesn't necessarily tell you who's playing the best right now. It doesn't necessarily tell you if the playoffs start, and that's why I always say if the playoffs started today, my pick might be, because the playoffs don't start today, and that pick could change from day to day. It is a league where I think there's a lot of I mean, I've talked about parity before. I think there's a decent amount of parity in the NHL. Obviously, this year it feels like it's a little different. The 8 teams in the East, we've known who they are right from the beginning, but I think that means that we'll likely see some pretty close series, and maybe we see some more upsets. Which, again, doesn't mean, like, if Florida plays the Capitals in the first round, and if the Capitals beat them, well, the Capitals have a 2018 Cup ring. The Capitals have been on runs before, right? And it might be like a last hurrah kind of thing for Ovechkin, Backstrom, and the boys. But it doesn't mean that Florida didn't have a great year and they didn't deserve to be number 1 in the power rankings. It just meant that they met a team in that first round that took them out. And maybe Washington isn't as good a matchup for them as Pittsburgh might be. Maybe Pittsburgh would be better, would be preferable for Florida. Maybe Boston would be preferable for Florida, and there are various factors in that, including scoring depth, experience, and, just sometimes it comes down to puck luck. And some teams just don't have any. And Florida and Toronto seem to be teams that haven't had puck luck in the playoffs, although in the regular season this year, they've been fantastic. But once we reach Sunday and that final game between Winnipeg and Seattle's finished and officially everybody's got 82 games in, then it's kind of a brand new year. And so I kind of really love the playoffs and the way it's all presented. And of course, every team has the Stanley Cup logo. That new logo looks fantastic, by the way. But it is interesting to me because it is a different beast altogether. And I really like the unpredictability of it. I really enjoy when the underdogs win in most cases. And I can appreciate it even if a team I cheer for is the favorite and the underdog knocks them out, like 2012. LA knocks out Vancouver. On some level, I was like, well, that sucks for Vancouver. But, man, LA looks really good, and I want to see how far they can go. So that's the thing. And then LA, of course, wins the Cup that year. Nobody had picked them. LA didn't even win half their games during the regular season that year. And so, yeah, it can really change at playoff time. And I don't think if I was keeping power rankings in 2012, LA would have even been top 10 going into the playoffs. They only won 40 out of 82 games. So it is interesting, of course, last year, Montreal, they didn't win half of their games. They ended up in the Stanley Cup final. And so, yeah, it can really change very quickly come playoff time. And unlike, I think it was 4 years ago was the last time I tried to do power rankings during the playoffs, it just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. So there you go. But let me know in the comment section below. Here's the question I have. Which team that right now would be a home ice team? Florida, Toronto, Calgary, Edmonton. Which of those teams? There's a lot of Canadian teams that have home ice advantage in the first round. But which of them do you think is most likely to get knocked out? Is Tampa Bay capable of going on another run? Does the fact that they're number 3 in their division right now matter? Does Tampa Bay's standing even matter? Because they've won the last 2 Stanley Cups and they weren't number 1 seeds either year. They were a number 3 seed in 2021. They were number 2 in the East in 2020. Does their seeding even matter? Or do you see a team that's being overrated right now? Let me know your comments or let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. And you never know. Your comment might end up aging really, really well, and you can come back in 2 weeks and go, see, I told you. I told you Florida was overrated. I told you Colorado was going to lose in the first round and they took their foot off the gas too soon. Let me know your thoughts, because honestly, it's a fascinating discussion to have. I think it's good that we see the amount of upsets we do. And whenever somebody talks about we need to make it so that the number one seeds, those top seeds, they get the easier opponent, yeah, it hasn't really necessarily mattered. When we had 5 versus 12, in both cases, Team 12 won. So it really comes down to who you're up against and how strong, and sometimes it comes down to mental toughness, various things. But let me know your thoughts. Hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through, you just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.